Hello, this is a prototype for a talk at the NYU Game Center for a VR event there. It's called Embodiment in VR, whatever that is. So, this is a talk that I'm doing from inside Tiltbrush. So, one qualification is pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Beware. I think that's a quote from The Wizard of Oz. Anyway, let's start. This talk is divided into two parts. VR, the medium itself, and then VR, the process, being inside VR. So this is part number one, VR, the medium. So the first point is that VR is physically engaging, obviously. But this isn't to be treated lightly. We'll go into this in more detail a little bit later. But total physicality is a big deal. You can tell that I love drawing in these mediums, whether it's tilt brush or quill or medium. But more about that in another talk. So then there's also the idea of time and the flow of information. When I mention time, I'm specifically talking about time as a thing, and VR has a funny relationship to time. Why? Because you're pretty much present in VR. And actually, as modern human beings, we're not used to not being distracted. So we have a funny relationship to the presence of presence. But it's super interesting to use time and scale differently in VR and reach a more symbolic use of time. So I'm talking about time here in quotation marks. What do I mean? I mean things like book time or film time, both of which, especially film, are very, very abstract, quite compressed. So here's a storyboard. A guy sees a girl, they exchange words. In a story, there's kind of conflict usually that will drive narrative, but here's a happy ending, and they walk away into the sunset together. Now, it's not to say that you could not do this in VR. I think that's actually a really interesting thing to start playing with as well as scale, but by and large, you're here right now. You're present, and things are happening in the moment that they're happening. The next notion to be explored in embodiment is this notion of realism. Not that this drawing is particularly realistic per se, but it serves the point. We tend to think of realism as important because of things like the holodeck. Things have to be airtight. But when we think of realism like this way, we usually think of it as visual fidelity. And visual fidelity in VR actually, at this point in time, backfires a little bit. What do I mean by this? Well, what is this? It's a river. It's a grove, a grotto with a rainbow. It's actually the uncanny valley. Anyway, let's go back to the head. Well, when things get so realistic, small details like the movement of the gaze of an eye or the movement of the body, if they're even subtly off, it makes us wince. So this dude, for example, isn't really even looking at me. And if I'm if I'm holding a conversation or I'm in his presence, it's going to put me off slightly. Plus, this is a white dude, and I can't identify with a white dude, even though I am one. No, specifically, when you get more and more realistic and more specific, you also alienate a lot of your audience as well. So Scott McCloud, in his book Understanding Comics, has a nice little bit where he talks about this. And he mentions less detail can be actually more inclusive. So this dude might work in some situations, but by being more abstract, we allow for more people to create more of a connection with him. There's another side tangent here, which is that part of the connection comes from what's portrayed outside, but part of it is also coming from your viewer. So your viewer is imposing meaning constantly on the situation. And as storytellers, we're actually not telling the viewer what to do. We're actually trying to get out of the way of them telling us the story. Anyway, it's another talk as well. But let's move over here. This is principally because reality, virtual or not, it doesn't just happen in our eyes. It happens in all of our senses. And actually the balance between all of them. And that's one of the reasons VR is really interesting. So here's an example. My friend Dario showed me the Vive a few years ago before it came out. And I did not want to put a headset on. It was the last thing I really wanted to try, but he said, well, just play with it for 5 minutes. And he gave me a silly archery game to do. And with a little bit of visuals, and kind of cartoon bow and arrow, and a little bit of oral feedback, when I pull the arrow back, and a little bit of haptic buzz in my hands, I'm standing in the middle of this empty room, feeling tension, but there's nothing in between my hands. That's realism. That's experience. A little bit of input from different senses, and your mind creates reality, experiences reality. And that's because that's what our mind is doing all the time, 24 hours a day, even when we sleep and our senses are quote unquote off. That's what our mind does. That's why the Dalai Lama evidently has said something to the effect of, all reality is virtual. Now, this is bringing me to the second point, part 2 of this little exercise. And that is the space of VR itself, VR as a process or as an act. Now, what is this? All right, it's a movie theater. Seeing movies in the dark on a huge screen is sensory deprivation, much like VR. Even though most people watch films now on their phones riding on the subway, this is how it started, and how it's most effective. And by the way, what exactly is this film playing here? Oh, it's the Lumiere brothers, the train pulling into the station. That's right, I've heard about this. So the story goes that the first time film was ever projected on a screen, one of the short films was a train pulling into the station. And when people saw a train physically coming toward them, life size, they ran out of the theater based on their physical response. Now, whether that's true or not, it's a famous story that I think makes the point. Now, here's an individual at attention. It's a kind of silly way to say that VR, like film before it, has the power to train our attention and make us focus for long periods of time. I was in tiltbrush for hours making this last night. And if it hadn't been 3 or 4 in the morning, I would have kept going. Which brings me to the best part of VR, or one of the best parts of VR, and that is making VR in VR. Doesn't mean that you have to be artistic. The important thing here in VR is that we create or co-create our experience. Here we have agency. We can look at different sides of something, like in immersive theater, or even in open world gaming. The narrative is up to us. It's up to what we find, and we're empowered to look around and discover things. Now that's amazing. Your reader has agency. Which brings me to this woman. I think you remember her. This is Flo. Sorry, it's late. Flow is an interesting concept, especially in gaming. All right. The idea here is that we are totally immersed mentally, emotionally, physically. We're fully functional to the best of our ability, leaning into the moment, fully alive. And the good news here is this is a muscle that we can train. And I believe if we learn it in one area, it can often overflow, no pun intended, into another. And that's partially why this is so good for learning. Now we come to the point in the talk where we have a quiz. What are the 3 ways in which we learn? All right, I'm having too much fun. 1, I'm loath to use the word empathy, but we learn emotionally. When we physically engage with stuff, we learn tactily and physically, and we also learn mentally. The mental stuff is the last. I'm putting the mental stuff last here because it's on the surface. It's floating on the surface of a big ocean of experience. The thing here is that when your mind, your body, and your emotions work together, it goes in really, really deep into us. And this is flow. This is also storytelling, and why storytelling is so powerful. Why we're storytelling creatures, storytelling animals, is because when you give people mental, emotional, and physical input, all working together, that's how we physically engage, that's how we emotionally engage, and that's how we walk away really feeling something. Now, storytelling in VR, that's an interesting topic. And again, that's for another talk. But I will say, in these new spaces, Information doesn't have to yell at us anymore. We will enjoy finding it. We will revel in participating in it. Now, this also helps us become our best selves. VR, AR, whatever it will become, it's not going away. The reason that this is important is because it's not completely here yet. It's not defined yet. So let's consciously and joyfully build this vocabulary together publicly, because it's important for the future too. So we need to codify a lot of this stuff before it goes, directly into entertainment and advertising. Not that those are necessarily bad things, but we have a moment right now